everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Something Dark. I hope you're having a great week so far, and I'm very happy to be back recording another episode for you. I can't believe we're on the 10th episode already, and I just want to say thank you for all the support on last week's episode. I know a lot of people found the case really interesting, and they like to hear my insight on the case and to hear it covered on my show. So just a big thank you for all the support. That brings us to tonight's case. At around 9:20 p.m. on a warm October night in 1989, three boys rode their bikes home along a dead-end road from the Tom Thumb store in St. Joseph, Minneapolis, where they had rented the Naked Gun. On a deserted stretch of the road, they were stopped by a man with a gun, dressed in black, with his face covered. The man told the boys to lie in a nearby ditch and asked the boys their age. Two of the boys were told to run to the woods without looking back, but one was taken. For nearly 27 years, the case went unsolved. No body, no abductor. Tonight we're covering the case of Jacob Wetterling. Jacob was 11 years old at the time of his abduction. He was born on February 17th, 1978. He was a sweet little boy who was adored by his parents, Jerry and Patty. That day started out like any other. Jacob actually went fishing that morning with his dad. And after a successful fishing trip, they made their way home, just in time to catch the Vikings game. After the game ended, Jerry took Jacob and his brother, Trevor, outside to toss the football around and play for a while. Patty and Jerry had plans that evening to go to a dinner party. They left the house around 5:30 p.m. They were going to dinner at a friend's house who lived about 20 minutes away. They weren't planning to be gone for long and expected to return home early. They decided to let the kids stay home alone. Their oldest daughter Amy wasn't there that night, but Jacob's parents told him he could have a friend stay over, so Jacob invited his best friend Aaron to stay over for the night. Aaron made his way over to Jacob's, and the boys were excited to be having a sleepover, especially because they didn't have to go to school the next day. When Jerry and Patty got to the dinner party, they called home to check on the kids. They also gave the phone number of the house they were in, just in case the kids needed to reach them. During the dinner party, Patty and Jerry got a call from Trevor, asking whether the kids could ride their bikes down to the local video rental shop. Patty said no. It was dark, and cars wouldn't be able to see them. She told them that they needed to think of something else to do. But when they hung up the phone, the kids revised their plan and decided to speak to their father. They told him they would have flashlights and wear reflective vests. Their father thought it was a well thought out plan, and since there were three of them, he said it was fine. Only 45 minutes after getting off the phone with them, another call came through. It was one of their neighbors. The neighbor told them they needed to come home immediately. Something had happened to Jacob, and he was missing. Jerry and Patty left the dinner party immediately and raced home. The neighbor then called the police and told them that Jacob had been taken when they were on their way home from the video rental shop. Trevor, Aaron, and Jacob set off from home with their bikes, with torches and reflective vests like they had promised. They lived in a rural area without streetlights. Aaron later said when they were passing one of the fields, he thought he heard something moving in the tall grass. He shrugged it off, thinking it was probably an animal. They made it down to the video rental shop and picked out the perfect movie for their sleepover. A few minutes later, they started their journey back home. On their way back, on a particularly dark stretch of road, a man dressed in dark clothing and a mask jumped out of a driveway. He had a revolver, and he ordered the boys to throw their bikes into a ditch and lie face down on the ground. Terrified, the boys complied. Then, the masked man asked each of the boys to give him their ages. Jacob's younger brother, Trevor, was told to run to a nearby wooded area, not to turn around or he would be shot. Next, he demanded the remaining boys to show him their faces. then told Aaron to run into the woods and not look back. He then grabbed Jacob by the elbow and began dragging him into a wooded area. Aaron ran as fast as he could to catch up with Trevor, and when he reached him, they looked back, and Jacob was gone. The two boys sprinted home. They called their parents, and 911 was contacted. Within 6 minutes of the 911 call, a sheriff's deputy was on the scene. He found the boys' bikes and immediately called for backup. Additionally, the FBI was alerted. When the police first arrived, they didn't believe Aaron and Trevor's story. They thought the boys had been playing with a gun and it had accidentally gone off. That they had accidentally shot Jacob, and now the two boys were covering for each other by making up this elaborate story. Luckily, this story wasn't long-lived, and police got to work to try and find Jacob. Throughout the night, Jacob was searched for. On Monday morning, October 23rd, the search was expanded and other agencies joined the investigation. Investigators were inundated with tips, and they found tire and shoe tracks that they thought might be important. Officers and volunteers conducted aerial and ground searches. The Wetterlings met with friends and made the conscious decision to seek as much publicity for the case as possible. The next day, an FBI expert in psychological profiles joined the case. They produced a suggestion that the abductor was likely a white loner with a physical deformity who committed a similar crime in his past. Investigators said they got hundreds of calls. The following day, a prayer vigil drew 500 people to St. Joseph Church. The sheriff said investigators were sure the abduction involved a sexual offender, and they thought the abductor had likely left the area and suggested Jacob could be dead. A TV show called A Current Affair broadcasted a national report on the abduction, which generated many more phone tips from around the country. Minneapolis and St. Paul business leaders offered a $100,000 reward for Jacob's safe return. Deputies searched on horseback, and the FBI assigned 20 agents to the case. 5 days after Jacob's disappearance, the National Guard, the State Patrol, and the Department of Natural Resources searched a 700 square mile area for Jacob, and the Wetterlings appeared on CBS This Morning. On November 6, 1989, investigators released a sketch to the public of a man seen in the Tom Thumb convenience store on the night of the abduction. They described him as glaring at customers and said that he was white, in his 50s, weighs 200 pounds, and has white hair. On November 12th, police released 2 more sketches. One is of a man heard talking about the abduction in Tom Thumb 2 weeks after it took place. The other is of a man thought to have tried to abduct a boy in the Minneapolis suburb of New Brighton. They said the 2 matched the earlier sketch with a man seen lurking in the Tom Thumb convenience store the night of Jacob's abduction. A flurry of tips followed. But on November 20th, 6 Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension and 5 FBI agents were taken off the case. It was a massive search with tons of media attention, but with each passing day, without any leads or evidence, the search went cold. Even though the media frenzy on the case died down, Jacob's family continued to follow leads, do public speeches, and anything they could do to get the word out to ensure Jacob would not be forgotten. In 2010, a blogger, Joy Baker, was looking for something to write about. She came across Jacob's case. She was fascinated and consumed by the story. She ended up contacting Jacob's mom, Patty. She started to put together her own theory of what she thinks could have happened. Joy Baker had been 22 when Jacob was abducted in 1989. She remembered the missing posters, the ongoing theories, and the pleads of Jacob's mother to bring him home. Joy discovered that 5 boys had all gone missing in the same area between the summer of 1986 and spring of 1987. One of these boys, Jared Skyrell, was abducted 9 months before Jacob in Cold Spring, which was very close to the Wetterlings' house. Jared was taken only 6 days before his 13th birthday, just 3 blocks from his house while walking home from a local cafe. Jared was approached by a man in a car. The man asked him for directions, and Jared, being a polite young boy, decided to help him. The man jumped out and grabbed Jared and threw him in his car. He told him that he had a gun and that he wasn't afraid to use it. Jared was driven 5 miles away to a remote area where he was sexually assaulted. The man drove him back into the town and asked him if he recognized him. When Jared said no, he let him out of the vehicle and told him to run, and if he looked back, he would be shot. The description of the man that Jared gave is extremely similar to the description Trevor and Aaron gave to police 9 months later. They all described the man to be of average height and weight with a low and raspy voice. Investigators were convinced they were unrelated. The crimes had taken place in 2 different counties, and the department seemed unwilling to work together. Joy Baker pursued every lead available to her and then some. She reached out to Jared, and the two began to piece together the evidence. And they found more unsolved sexual assaults involving young boys in the area. Each boy said the same thing about the man. He had told them to run or I'll blow your head off, or some other reference to gun violence. Joy alerted the Stearns County Sheriff's Office, who told her that they had never heard of these assaults, but didn't believe they were connected to Jacob. Joy and Jared spent hundreds of hours searching for other victims to get their stories. They relentlessly harassed the county sheriff's office. They involved Jacob's mother, and they did interviews with local media. They had a hard time getting law enforcement to take their search seriously. Jacob's story was featured on John Walsh's CNN TV show, The Hunt. The episode included Jared's assault and compared the 2 cases. This was the final media push that was needed to get the FBI to reopen the investigation. On October 28th, in 2015, some 26 years after Jacob's disappearance, a man named Danny Heinrich was named a person of interest in the case and arrested. So, who is Danny Heinrich? Back in December of 1989, the year that Jacob was taken, Danny had actually been questioned by the FBI. He had also been a suspect in Jared's assault, but there wasn't enough evidence to convict. Danny was a known child predator in the area, and he had been investigated for multiple crimes involving children. They didn't have enough evidence to link Jacob to Danny, and he was let go. But Danny's DNA was actually connected to the abduction of Jared through DNA evidence on Jared's sweater. Unfortunately, by the time the authorities matched Danny's DNA to Jared's case, the statute of limitations had expired, and no charges could be brought against him. Luckily, even though the statute of limitations had expired, they now had enough cause to search Danny's house. And upon searching his house, police uncovered some pretty damning things. They found child pornography, and as a result, they were able to arrest him. As a part of a strange plea bargain, Danny decided to cooperate with the authorities. Part of the agreement was to confess to the murdering of Jacob and reveal the location of his body. He accepted. And on September 1st of 2016, Danny showed the FBI where he had buried Jacob 27 years earlier. The plea bargain meant that Danny would only be charged for child pornography possession. He would serve a maximum sentence of 20 years in a federal medical center in Massachusetts. This is what his chilling confession revealed about what happened that night in 1989. That night, he was driving around with no clear plan for the night. He came across the 3 boys riding their bikes. He said he parked his car, put on his mask, and waited for the boys to come closer to him. He grabbed Jacob at gunpoint and handcuffed him. Jacob cried and asked, "What did I do wrong?" Danny drove him from St. Joseph to Painesville, 30 miles away. And after arriving in a remote area of Painesville, he took Jacob to a gravel pit. They got out of the car, and he removed Jacob's clothes and brought him to a grove of trees where he molested him. Jacob cried and said, "I'm cold, I want to go home." Danny told the police he was able to avoid detection by listening to a police scanner. He heard sirens in the distance, and although they had nothing to do with him, he got scared and he panicked. He decided to shoot Jacob. He told Jacob to turn around, and he raised his revolver to the back of Jacob's head. As he pulled the trigger, the gun jammed. Danny said he pulled the trigger a second time, and Jacob fell to the ground. Danny walked home to the Plaza Apartments in Painesville, but returned a couple of hours later to bury Jacob in a shallow grave. 1 year later, Danny returned and discovered the remains had been partially uncovered. He could even see Jacob's jacket. He moved the bones and clothes to a farm across the highway where he dug a trench 2 feet deep. That's where Jacob remained for nearly 27 years. A small silver lining came from this case. In 1994, the Jacob Wetterling Act was passed. This was the first law to institute a state sex offender register, and after Jacob's abduction, Patty and Jerry formed the Jacob Wetterling Foundation, which is an advocacy group for children's safety. The foundation is dedicated to spreading education and awareness about sexual predators, how it happens, and what we can do to prevent it. And that brings us to the end of tonight's case. A little bit of a shorter episode for you this evening, but I hope you found this case interesting. I think it's insanity that this guy is not being charged for murder. He's only being detained under the child pornography charges, which is shocking. The case is so upsetting, so tragic, and watching the news reports from the family are heartbreaking. His mother says that they didn't think of him as dead until the day they heard the news that his body was discovered. There's lots of different sources of more information on the case if you want to check up online. You can also read through the transcript of the trial with Danny. I will warn you, it is extremely graphic. I read through it just to see if there was any other information that I could put into my episode, and it goes into detail of the abuse that he inflicted on those 2 little boys, the way that he buried the body. He came back a year later to see that there was bones and Jacob's skull and the jacket, and then took it to another nearby farm where he buried it again. He seems very matter of fact in the trial. I don't know if he is just trying to be professional because he's in court, but it seems as if there is no emotion behind what he did. That night, he didn't have a clear victim in mind or a clear target. He was basically just out on the prowl, looking at pictures of the area that the boys were in and that long stretch of dark road. It is extremely creepy. I watched some news recordings of when Aaron and Trevor were speaking, saying that it was so dark that night that you couldn't see anywhere that your flashlight wasn't shining. It was pitch black. And in those rural areas, there is no light pollution whatsoever. If you're lucky, you can get some light from the moon, but that's about it. I can imagine how creeped out they were on the way there. Aaron said that he thought he heard something in the bushes and he just shrugged it off as an animal, but he said he physically got chills, but he just shrugged it off. And then on the way back, Danny was laying in wait for them. A lot of podcasts and media made a lot out about the dad and how the mom had said no and that he should have just listened to her. And I don't think any blame can be put on him. I'm sure he's already blamed himself enough for what has happened. The only party that is responsible for this and that can be blamed is Danny Heinrich himself. He is the monster at the end of the day. But like I said, if you're interested in learning more about this case, there are a lot of resources online, including the trial transcript, but as mentioned, trigger warning, it's quite graphic. That brings us to the end of tonight's episode. I want to say a big thank you for watching. Don't forget to follow the podcast on Spotify, and if you can, if you're on Apple Podcasts and you like the podcast, please leave me a 5-star rating. I would really, really appreciate it. So thank you for listening, and I will talk to you in my next episode.